Hey, welcome Riverview to our online experience. We are so glad that you're joining us today. If you notice, this background looks a little different because we are in our brand new location. And if you haven't had a chance to stop by yet, we encourage you to do so. In fact, for the entire summer, we're going to have Riverview at sunset right here. We begin at 4:30 with the food trucks and just a great time to be together with the Riverview family. And then at 5:30, we come here indoors for worship and message, and just a great time of encouragement. So we hope you enjoy this service, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Father. Give you all the praise this morning. Clouds. He's coming on the clouds. Kings and kingdoms will bow down, and every chain will break as broken hearts declare His praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Sing it out. Our God is a lion, the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb, and every knee will bow before Him. Let's sing, so open up the gates. So open up the gates, make a way before the King of Kings. Yeah. Oh, the God who comes to save is here to set the captives free. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is a lion, the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before Him. Our God is a Lamb, the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb, and every knee will bow before Him. Every knee will bow before You, Lord. Thank You, Jesus. Let's sing this together. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Lift your voice. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Yeah, yeah. Who can stop the Lord Almighty? Who can stop the Lord Almighty? There is no one who can stop the Lord Almighty. Oh, who can stop the Lord? Come on, let's sing our God. Our God is a lion, the We invite your presence this morning, God. Have your way in this place, Jesus. The weapon may be formed, but it won't prosper. When the darkness falls, it won't prevail. 'Cause the God I serve knows only how to triumph. My God will never fail. Oh, my God will never fail. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. Oh, thank you, Jesus. There's power in the mighty name of Jesus. Every war he wages, he will win. Oh, I'm not backing down from any giant, 'cause I know how this story ends. Yes, I know how this story ends. 'Cause I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. 'Cause I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. I'm gonna see a victory. I'm gonna see a victory. For the battle belongs to you, Lord. Gonna worship my way through this battle, Lord. Gonna worship my way through it. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good. You turned it for good. Come on, lift your voice. Hey. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good. You turned it for good. Come on, declare it this morning. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good. You turned it for good. Thank you, Lord. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good. You turned it for good. Come on. 'Cause you take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good. You turned it for good. You take what the enemy meant for evil, and you turned it for good.
And this whole series has just been, to me, has been really, really cool. This idea of faith builders. And what I know about life is usually life is taking faith away. In fact, that's why James wrote this letter of James. He said, look, I get it. He said the environment that they were living in at the time was a crazy environment. Like economically, it was crazy. Politically, it was crazy. Socially, it was crazy. It reminds me of now. Like it was the same. Like what James was writing about in his letter. And you got to remember, and Danny shared this again last week with us, that James was a skeptic. Like this whole Jesus thing, and what's crazy about James being a skeptic is he was actually the younger brother of Jesus. Like he was one of Jesus's siblings, one of the brothers or sisters that Jesus had. James was one of them. Like he had been there the whole time. Like, and finally, because of the event, the cross, the crucifixion of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, he went from being a skeptic to a servant of his brother, to a servant of Jesus. And he writes this incredibly practical letter to us today. And I just want to give you guys a little pro tip tonight. If you have not yet, I want you to read James' letter. I want you to pretend like you were one of those early churches that James was writing to, even though it's a today church and not a back then church. And I want you just to read the letter. It's only a couple chapters long, 5 chapters. It's super short, but read it like a letter. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember when I used to get letters from Annette, like we used to date when letters were like a thing because phone calls were like so expensive and texting was not even a thing, right? So we wrote letters. And what was cool about a letter is you wrote a letter and you mailed a letter, but the letter didn't show up for a couple days later. And then you had to wait for them to read the letter a couple days later and then write their own letter and respond to you. And it was like over a week, right? This cycle. Well, you don't have to wait for James' letter. It's here now. Like you can just open it up and read it in your favorite Bible app. If you've got like a real Bible, you can even read it in that. And that would be super cool. But read his letter. It is so, so awesome. And here's one of the things that I have picked up, and maybe you have picked up in this letter that James wrote for us today, as well as for his family back then. Here's what I love about it. It is so practical, and he says this. Look, he says, my brother Jesus, he says that his family is different. It's not the same as all these other families and all these other groups and not even all the other religions that were religions back in during that time. He says, my brother's family, Christians, are different. And we have a different playbook. And if you got your outline this evening, I just want you to pull that out and you can take some notes and jot them down as we go along. And we'll have some verses up here on the screen for you as well. But James says, look, my brother Jesus says that we have a different playbook, and I want you to understand that. We don't play by the same rules, and we don't play the same game that everybody else plays. In fact, our playbook is not only a different playbook, it's a better playbook. And it's a better playbook because in my playbook, people actually matter. You see, if you were to summarize the ministry of Jesus, and maybe like us, you've been following along and watching The Chosen, and you kind of start to get this idea, and you start to get this understanding, you start to get this insight that Jesus really actually cared about people, not religion. They had played the religion game during the time of Jesus. In fact, that's one of the reasons they killed Jesus, is because Jesus wouldn't play the religion game, because Jesus actually cared about people. Because our playbook is a better playbook. It's not about religion. It's not about ritual. It's about people, all people. Rich, poor, powerful, powerless, famous, or even infamous people. These were the kinds of people that Jesus spent time with and Jesus loved. People like us. Sitting in this room right now. This is what Jesus' playbook looks like. Here's the problem. And I don't know if it's a problem for you, and maybe it's a problem for me, and maybe it's just a problem for some of my friends that I like to hang around with and have conversations with. But the problem is simply this. The problem is there's a difference between what we say we believe oftentimes as the church today and how we live. There's a difference. And so a lot of my friends who grew up in the church and walked away from the church or thinking about maybe joining the church, and they look at me and they say, don't you understand that there's a difference between what I hear people say they believe and how they actually live their lives? Like, why do you do that? Why do you live with this discrepancy? Why do you live one way but say that you should be living another way? And James was so aware of this because you see, during the time of James in the early church, and this all happened just a couple decades after the time of Jesus, people literally started to walk away from the church. They said, you know what? No thanks. Because of outside pressures, but also because internally they started to see things they did not like in the church. And maybe a part of your journey story is the same story where you go, you know, I don't know. I hear people talk about how amazing it is to follow Jesus, and yet what I see is not amazing at all. I want to push this just a little bit further, and I wrote this down. Here's the question. Who is it for you? Who is it for you in your life? Who is it for you in your life that maybe you're looking for that affirmation, or maybe taking it to a different angle, maybe it's that person in your life that you don't want to have anything to do with. Maybe it's that person in your life that you go, I don't think so. I wrote this down. I said, whose approval will you approve of, and who will you approve? Who's looking for your approval? In other words, there's this game oftentimes that we play in real life, and it's kind of this game of you're in and you're out, and I like you, but I don't really like you, and I want to sit by you, but I don't really want to sit by you. And who is it that you're looking for approval from, and who is it that's looking for approval from you? Maybe as a child growing up, you realize, and I got to tell you, as a dad, especially as a dad in ministry, I understood early on the pressure that I had and the pressure my kids had to grow up as pastors' kids. Huge, crazy amount of pressure. And because of that, I knew that it was so important for me to make sure that I loved my kids in such a way that no matter what they did, and the times that they would step in it, that they knew they were loved unconditionally. Bigger and better than what it was to be a pastor. I'm also aware of this at school. As a teacher, I look around, man, and some of the kids that we have sitting in our seats and in our classrooms today are damaged kids. They are growing up in environments, and they are growing up in homes where they don't know up and down, they don't know right and wrong, and they are desperately looking for some type of approval. Somebody to simply say, I love you unconditionally. Even those fun knuckleheads that I get to send outside of my classroom. It's like, you need to go have a little time out. I'm going to go talk to you in a minute. And it's so funny because oftentimes when I go out to talk to those very kids, they look at me like, D. Higgs, are you really upset with me? I said, no, but you need to quit acting stupid, okay? Like, get back in there. Let's go. And those are the same kids that write the sweetest letters at the end of the school year. And those are the kids that say, D. Higgs, can we please hang out this summer? They're just looking for somebody to love them. They're looking for approval. They're looking for somebody who says, I see you, I get you, and I care about you. Or maybe it's in the workplace, and we seek this validation, right, from our bosses or maybe our peers, and we're hoping maybe they come alongside and say, man, I saw that. That was so cool. I love doing this little thing with my junior high team at school. We'll get together a couple times a year, and I like to pull out a stool. And as soon as I pull up the stool, usually I hear a groan. It goes something like this. Oh. Do you guys do that with me? Ready? Oh. No, one more time. Ready? Oh. Yeah, that's exactly what they do. And they just kind of look at me like, oh, no, not this stool. Right in the groan. And we play hot seat. And hot seat is simply this. We just go one by one. Everybody takes a turn in the hot seat. And the hot seat is for one purpose. And whoever's sitting in that hot seat, everybody just gets to love on them. Everybody just gets to encourage them. Everybody just gets to say, hey, here's what I really appreciate about you. And I got to tell you something, that even though people resist and even though people go, I don't want to be in the hot seat, oh, right? When they're in the hot seat, I got to tell you, if you look at their faces, it's amazing to watch, just as they are receiving validation from their peers and validation from their coworkers. And all of a sudden they're like, you know, this is okay. I get used to this. Man, these people really do care about Or maybe for you, it's in a relationship and you're waiting for your Hallmark moment. And I know I talk too much about Hallmark. I just can't help it. It's just a disease. And some of you know it's a disease, but you have the same disease, so it's okay. So, but you're waiting for that Hallmark moment where all of a sudden they get it and you know it and they know it and everything's cool. And the last 2 minutes, what happens? They kiss. Exactly. Thank you. And now I know who watches Hallmark in here. Beautiful. So this tension is not a new tension of who's in and who's out and who fits and who doesn't fit and all that kind of stuff. It's really an old tension. And what I want to do this evening is just spend a couple minutes and take a look at what James has to say on behalf of God about this tension. And this will be encouraging. Now, if you got your Bibles, we're going to start actually where Danny left off last week, bro. So we're going to start in James chapter 1, but we're going to go all the way to the end, and we're going to start in verse 27 of James chapter 1. James chapter 1. And this was so cool, and Danny just kind of delivered this perfectly for me, bro. Thank you, this little jump-off spot for this week. And this is what James writes. He says this. He says, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God, everybody say God, the Father, means caring for what? Orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world do what? Corrupt you. So he says, look, it kind of looks like this. This is religion. Religion isn't going in and checking a box and going in and saying, hi, Pastor, I'm here, and going over and making sure, you know, hey, God, did you see me? I was at church today and I dropped a couple bucks in the offering. You see, that was the religion of Jesus' time. And what James is writing, what he learned from his brother Jesus was different. He says, look, pure religion, genuine religion in the sight of God our Father is actually caring for other people, especially for those that are disadvantaged, especially for those who can't take care of themselves or help themselves. That's what it looks like. And then he says, by the way, and don't let the world corrupt you. Jesus says, look, our faith is not about rituals. Just push that over to the curb. Our faith is about a relationship, and our faith is about how we live and how we love other people and how we love God. It's that simple. And then James gets personal over in James chapter 2, and flip over to the next chapter, and this is where we're going to dive in for the next couple minutes. In James chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, he says, look, this is what pure religion looks like. It's to take care of those that are disadvantaged. Then he says this in verse 1. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? Now, during the time of James, every time you wrote a question like that, the answer was already presupposed. The answer was like, you can't. James knew that, but he was being rhetorical so that we would have to wrestle with what he was writing. Now, the reason is, and he goes on to say this in verse 2, he says, for example, suppose someone comes into your meeting, into your room, into your synagogue, into your church. By the way, who did we say is already here, Danny? Jesus. He's already here. He says, so suppose, for example, suppose someone comes into your meeting where Jesus is already at, dressed in fancy clothes. We don't do that here. We're all good. We're all good. And expensive jewelry. And another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention to the one and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there or else sit on the floor. Ouch. Everybody say ouch. Now, years ago, when we had started the gathering, we had this couple. Their name is Jack and Diane, just like in the song. I know, you're just thinking to yourself, really? Yeah, like John Mellencamp was in the back, like singing. It was like so cool. So Jack and Diane were homeless. And Jack and Diane would come to church every Sunday, and they would sit in the very back. Do you know why they sit in the very back? You know why? They smelled really bad. And they knew that. But they wanted to be in fellowship and they wanted to be in community. And it was so amazing to watch our little gathering family come alongside Jack and Diane and say, you want to come sit with us? And they're like, nah, we're just going to sit back here. We know we don't smell real good. But just to watch before service and after service how people would hang out with Jack and Diane. And then we found this out. Jack and Diane had never had a proper wedding. They had been married, but never had a proper wedding. You know what I'm talking about? Like a church wedding. And so our little church, The Gathering, went to town and they threw a wedding for Jack and Diane. And it was like the coolest thing, man. He had his little cowboy hat and his little Levi's, right? And his little nicest shirt, right? Button-up shirt. And the gals got Diane looking all pretty and all sweet and all kind of good. And it was so, so fun to watch our little church family just love up on Jack and Diane. And I thought as I would read these verses that we're reading here this evening, and I thought, man, I'm so glad we didn't do that publicly. But I still wonder about what we do privately on the inside. And let me explain. And let me ask as a question. So who is it for you? How can you claim, this is what James says, how can you claim to trust Jesus when we play the favor game? Like how do we do that? Like you walk into a room, or I walk into a room, maybe it's this room, maybe there's other rooms that we walk into, and we instantly start to look around in that room, and we kind of go, who's in and who's out? Who in this room brings advantage to me? Who can I leverage maybe for my own benefit? And who do I want to have sit over there across the room? I really don't want to spend much time with them. We begin to assess the room. In our family, my brother's here, my sister's not, which is good because I like my brother more. But my brother's here, my mom is here, and it's so funny because every time it's like Mother's Day or Father's Day or a birthday, we play this little game within our family, and the game is simply this. And it's like, you know Mom likes me the most, right? Like I'm the favorite, right? And we play that game, we text that game, we sign that in our card, your favorite son, your favorite daughter, all this kind of stuff. And it's kind of a fun game that we play, and it's a game that really is a game that says, like we love you. I think, is that how it really goes?
It's really about the money.
It's really about the money, yeah. But anyway, So it's this idea with love, your favorite, whatever type of thing. We play this favorite game in our family, even though it's kind of a love game. It's kind of a fun thing, but I thought, boy, in real life when we do that, that is not cool at all. That gets really, really painful. Now I'm going to flip this upside down. This is where it gets really tragic. This is where it gets really difficult. This is where it gets really challenging for me and maybe for you, and it's in this place. As often as we tend to do that with other people, inside we also know that people do that with us. And we ask this question, where do I fit in? Where do I fit into this group? Or where do I fit into this meeting? Or where do I fit, right? And we begin to size up the room, and we begin to kind of look around and say, okay, here, this person's here and that person's here and I'm here. Or maybe we even do that when we come into church. And we ask the question, where do I fit in? Who are the people in the room that I want to impress? Who are the influencers in the room that I want to get next to? The people who bring me benefit. I know it's so painful. The one that you want to ignore. In other words, the one that you say, you don't bring me any benefit. There is no upside to my relationship with you. We begin to judge, and we begin to kind of have this little inside of us tension. And the problem with the tension, and we have to pay attention to the tension because every time it's there, it's telling us that there's something going on in my life that's not quite right, that doesn't quite measure up. And do you know who suffers when we play this game? It's something that God values highly. It's community. And it's you. You see, when we play this game, it becomes about more or less, who has more and who has less. And it's what is happening in our country today, isolation and division. And you can go down 100 different roads and you can point 100 different fingers on why this is happening today. But all I know is our country is becoming more and more divided. And this pandemic that we just are now on the tail end and coming out of, so have the churches. The community of God, God's family, has taken the brunt of this. And he looks at us today and he says, don't. And there's even a bigger question. I wrote this down on your outline, and the bigger question is this, not just why do we play this game and why is there this tension about the haves and the have-nots and who's in and who's out. The bigger question is this, why do we do it? Why do we even go down these roads in the first place? Why do we play these little judging games and who do I value games? And in verse 4, James unpacks this for us and he says this, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil, what is the word? Motives. I don't know about you, but I don't even like that word because I don't even like my own motives. Excuse me, Darren, aren't you a pastor? I am. But our motivations to seek out those that have power and position and seeking out pleasure. And then James asks us about our motivations. Heck, I don't even know where my motivations come from half the time when I walk into that room and I look around in that room. But I know I'm not alone. I know it's true for many of us. Because God looks at the inside, not the outside. He wants us to live inside out. And this is what he says in Proverbs. I love this. When Solomon writes these words in Proverbs 16, verse 2, he says, people may be pure in their own eyes. In other words, we look in the mirror and we kind of go, man, I got it going today. This is good. I've got a good day going on. Hey, look at me, everybody. But the Lord examines their motives. God says, look, I know you look all shiny clean on the outside, but I'm going to go right into the heart of the matter, and I'm going to really dive into what's going on in here. And the reason he does that, the reason he looks at our heart, the reason he looks at our motives is not because he's mad at us. He just wants to reveal to us that we may not be living the way he wants us to live. Our motivation might be way, way off. Jeremiah writes this in Jeremiah 17. He says in verse 9, the human heart is the most deceitful thing of all. Everybody go, ow. And desperately what? Wicked, like yikes. Jeremiah like throttled back just a little bit and he's going, no. He says, who really knows how bad it is? But I, the Lord, search all hearts and examine secret motives. Like God's in there with his little flashlight looking around saying, oh, okay, ooh, here's a little corner, look at this. Because he wants to reveal that to us. So it's an area that we can work on before God. Then he says this, I give all people their due reward. Everybody go, uh-oh. According to what their actions deserve. Like, yikes. Like, no wonder God wants us to check our motives because he doesn't want our motives to get us. He wants to make sure that our motives are good motives, pure motives. We've got this inner battle going on between what I should do and what I shouldn't do. And here's the result of playing favorites. You and I get smaller. We get smaller. We don't get bigger. We don't leverage these relationships like, hey, look at me, I'm hanging around with so-and-so. How cool is that? The result of playing favorites is we get smaller, we get less, we get even more disappointed. Because we realize that that is not satisfying. We realize that that is not fulfilling. Every time we pick and choose who is in and who is not. I want to give you a little secret this evening. The secret is simply this. You and I, we're all in the same boat. We don't act like it sometimes, and we pretend like we're not really in the same boat, but we really are in the same boat. Someone will always have more money, more influence, more stuff, and somebody will always have less. By the way, do you know that Jesus would have been a less? Jesus didn't have anything. He owned like nothing. He had a little backpack. That was Jesus. He would have been the guy that you would have went, I'm not sure how I can leverage my relationship with you to benefit me at all. That's Jesus. And Jesus was just fine with that because he goes, you don't even really know what I have to offer. And James continues in verse 5. He says, listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you dishonor the poor. Isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who slander Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? Like James had watched his brother Jesus, and he learned about the heart of God by watching Jesus, the way he related to his Father. And James is saying, we get it all wrong. We don't really understand. He says, rich, solid, and unshakable faith comes from God alone, not from other people. Just ask someone who only has Jesus in their corner. They'll tell you about their rich faith, because Jesus is all they have. In The Chosen, it's funny how oftentimes we see these little snapshots of Jesus and who he hung around with, and none of this was lost on James, the brother of Jesus. Jesus would hang out with the people that society said, those are the have-nots. And yet that's where we find Jesus time after time after time. With the outcast, with the downtrodden, with those that were hurting, those that were suffering, not those who had it all figured out. As if to say, the poor have a very special place in my heart. They need help and they know it. They don't depend on what they have. They depend on me. You know what God loves to hear from you and I? He loves to hear things like, God, I need your help. I need you to show up. God, I need you to figure this out for me. I need you to work in this situation that I'm in right now. In other words, we're saying, God, I don't have this. I need you to have this. I need you to work. I need you to show up. I need to see you in action. Not my wisdom, but your wisdom. Not my ability, but your ability. Not my power, but your power. When that happens, God leans over and he says, this is exactly what I want to hear. And the other problem is simply this. Every time that we try to suck up to other people, we tend to bend towards compromise. We bend towards kind of maybe giving in a little bit. We bend towards maybe doing things that we know that the Lord would not want us to do in the way we're living for him. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. In verse 3, he says, look, God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for him. For the kingdom of heaven is theirs. It's theirs. Like they've discovered it already, depending on God. So James goes on in verse 8 and he says, look, I want to tell you, this is what royalty looks like. In verse 8, he says, yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures. And here it is. Love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. For the person who keeps all of the laws except for even one is guilty as a person who has broken all of God's laws. In other words, we are playing favorites. And God calls that simply a sin. He says, don't do that. Not in my family. We have a better playbook than that. Don't go down those roads. The road that I want to give you is super simple. Just love others. Do you remember that time when Jesus decided to go have dinner over at Matthew's house? And he invited Matthew to come follow him. And he says, Matthew, come follow me. And Matthew was a tax collector. Nobody liked Matthew except Jesus. Even Simon Peter, if you're watching The Chosen, even he was like, not Matthew, I don't like this guy, right? He tried to take my boat away. But there is Jesus having dinner at Matthew's house, and Matthew throws this great dinner, and you look around the table, and who's at that table? And it was like, man, people were in that room that most people would not want to hang around with. And all of a sudden, a couple religious leaders, a couple Pharisees show up outside of his door, and they look in the courtyard where this dinner is taking place, and they're like, what is going on? This Jesus guy, who we don't understand who he is eating with tax collectors and other notorious sinners? And Jesus said, yeah. Because those are the people that need me. Those are the people that get it. These are the people in this room that understand that they bring nothing to the table. They have no power. They have no position. They have no place in society. But with me and my Father's kingdom, they get to sit in the front row. That's how much I care about them. So here's what is so dangerous about playing favorites and comparing. I just wrote down a couple ideas. Number one, what message are we signaling to others about our faith? And I wonder if we have bought into this lie, this concept that what we are really presenting to other people, it's not really even what Jesus taught. It's religion. And Jesus wanted to stamp out religion. He did everything he could to put religion aside because he said religion is about do's and don'ts. Religion is about trying to just check a box. He says, I came that people would have life and have it abundantly. People would learn to love God and to love others genuinely, not as an act. Number two, what is so dangerous about playing favorites and comparing? Number two, we lose sense of who God made us to be. Because all of a sudden we realize that we're starting to value what other people think of us versus what God thinks of us. Instead of going by his playbook and how much he cares about us, we're concerned about others. Number three, insecurity. Others drive who we are and who we become. Wanting to be accepted, wanting to be valued, wanting to fit in. And again, oftentimes ending up compromising. And number four, we realize that it's never enough. Our purpose becomes to please others instead of pleasing God. We sell out. And then we wonder why we never feel satisfied. Jesus said it this way in Mark chapter 12. He says in verse 29, Jesus replied when he was asked this great question, what is the most important thing? He says, the most important commandment is this. Number one, you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your mind, and all of your strength. Everything that you are, love God. Like give it all to God. Like be sold out for God first and foremost. And number two, in verse 31, the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these. And again, you can see everybody taking notes and writing this down. Okay, Jesus, we got the first one, love God. Second one is love others. What's next? And he goes, that's all. It's that simple. But I need you to do it. I need you to do it in the face of a culture today that is becoming more divided, more angry, more skeptical, more cynical. I need you to do it in spite of, because it's the one thing that can salvage our community, our nation, our world. So what does it look like? I want to just close with this. We for many years, made being the hands and feet of Jesus a priority. Not because people warranted it, not that people deserved it, just because Jesus told us that's what we should do. And so for years, as a church community, as a church family, we would go across the border down into Mexico and we would build houses for people that didn't have a house. I remember this one year, there were 3 houses that we ended up building at the last minute. In fact, we actually just got the phone call about 2 weeks before we were ready to head down there. In each house, we'd raise about $7,000. So all of a sudden they said, look, a house in a whole little neighborhood. These families, they just got decimated by a fire, an electrical fire, and they have nothing. Now, you got to understand, they had nothing to begin with. When we go down there, we see that most of them are just kind of hiving off electricity by throwing wires over the electrical lines up above, and then they just go across the street, and like kids are just walking across these hot electrical wires. And they live in these little tiny shacks. They just scrape together whatever they can. Or we would go down to the Dominican Republic, and we work with this little village that we adopted called Algodon. And in this little village called Algodon, the day that we showed up and looked around, we went, "Are you kidding me? This is how these people live. In shacks. Like they've got nothing. Like they have pigs in the backyard wallowing around in a filthy, stinky, sewery swamp. Like they have zip. And so for years, we would pack boxes and send food, and we'd put school supplies together, and we'd send that down, and we would go down, and we would take several trips down there. And I remember one time we were in Haiti, and we were working with a group called Children of the Nations. And in Haiti, there was this older sister sitting with her little brother and her little sister. And we had thrown camp for all these kids in this one little neighborhood. And it was Wednesday, and during this camp, it was lunchtime, and during lunchtime, there was this incredible staff that were there. They're preparing this meal, and they were cooking up beans and rice and chicken, and it was a feast for these kids. It was a feast for these families. And there was this one older sister, and when I say she was an older sister, she was like 13. And her little brother and sister, probably about 4 and 5 years old, they had finished the meal and they had looked around the table, and she took this bag that she had next to her, and she opened up this bag. And she began to take the plates of a leftover food, and there was a little bit of rice or a little bit of beans or some leftover chicken, and she would take these plates and she would start to scrape those leftovers into her bag, because that was going to be their meal for the next dinner and the next breakfast and the next lunch and the next dinner for days and days and days. They had nothing. Every year I take kids down to Sleepless San Diego, and we spend the night and we learn more about the homeless population here in our city. You see, here's the problem. The problem is we have divided God's family into the haves and the have-nots. And James is calling that out. He's calling that out in the church. He's calling that out in communities. And he says, look, this is what we're doing. He says we play this game of judging other people, and we've got to stop that. He says in verse 12, so whatever you say and whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others, but if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges. Hey guys, we just want to say thank you for joining us today for today's message and service online. Again, if you are trying to get some traction in your faith right now as we do this series called Faith Builder, we would encourage you just to click on the link down below, or there's a QR code that's going to pop up, and that's going to take you to our Jumpstart. And it's just a great, easy to use, fun little video mini series for you to help jumpstart your faith. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we hope that this week is amazing.